Welcome to Mexico Matters, the CSIS podcast about how events occurring in Mexico can impact and, more importantly, matter in the United States. I am Mariana Campero, non-resident senior associate of the Americas program at CSIS and the former CEO of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. On June 2nd, Mexico made history by electing its first woman and Jewish president. Claudia Sheinbaum won by a landslide of almost 60% of the vote. That is about 30 percentage points over her main rival, Xochitl Gálvez. Moreover, her party Morena also won the Chamber of Deputies, the Senate, and now hold 29 out of 31 states in Mexico and Mexico City. To explain why did the market react so negatively to such a victory, and what might Claudia do with so much power, that it is truly my pleasure to welcome Dr. Carlos Elizondo Mayer-Serra, professor and researcher at the Monterrey Tec and a former ambassador to the OCDE. Carlos, welcome to Mexico Matters. Carlos, welcome to Mexico Matters. It is truly a pleasure to have you on the show today, particularly now when the Mexican elections are so fresh. Can you please explain to us what happened?
It is my pleasure, Mariana. Great opportunity to be with you and with your public. Thanks for the invitation. What happened? Well, there was an election, and the election had an astonishing, very open result. I mean, this is a clear mandate in favor of current President Lopez Obrador's party. As you all know, there's no re-election in Mexico, so that was the reason he wasn't competing. This is, in fact, the first election since the year 2000 when we haven't been seeing in the ballot Lopez Obrador's name, at least in Mexico City. So he was not in the ballot, but it was all about him. Therefore, for him, it is a great result. Let me very quickly explain the results because our public might not be reading the papers with the detail that we do. The election took place Sunday. Elections in Mexico are always in Sunday. Big difference with the US. It is based on the principle that you have to vote, and it's easier to vote if it's not a working day. For Mexicans, it's a little strange that you vote on Tuesday, but that's a different issue. A lot of positions were at stake. Of course, the most important, the presidency, where Claudia Sheinbaum won by almost 30 points of advantage over the second place, Xochitl Gálvez. And in a very distant place, with 10 points of voting, the John Álvarez Maínez of Movimiento Ciudadano. So there's no doubt that this is a tremendous victory for President Lopez Obrador. Morena wins, and with his allies, it has two allies, the Partido del Trabajo, the Workers' Party, just to give some flavor to Mexican politics. The Workers' Party admires the government of North Korea. We have this other party, which is the Green Party, which is more like a political group that have understood well how to make use of the political system, because it's not a real Green Party. I mean, they went against the Tren Maya that destroyed vast stretches of jungle in the Yucatan Peninsula.
It's green with a taint of red.
Exactly. With the three of them are almost had won the constitutional majority in the Chamber of Deputies, which means they can change the constitution as they want, and are almost there in the Chamber of Senate. They lack 4 votes to have control as well for the constitutional majority to change the constitution. They also won of the 9 federal states that were at stake. They won 7 of them, including Mexico City and Yucatan, that have been quite well governed by the PAN.
Surprising that they won Yucatan.
Yeah, so it's a massive victory. And the question is, what are they going to do with all this power?
Carlos, literally, you just asked my next question. What do you think they are going to do with all of this power? As you said, they clearly have a very strong mandate. And prior to this election, Lopez Obrador had actually not only said what he wanted to do, which is to pass the reforms that he was unable to pass during his administration, but Claudia also said that she wanted to build the second floor of AMLO's transformation. What is your take?
Well, as you said, they did promise what are they going to do, or what were they going to do in case of winning the constitutional majority. President Lopez Obrador introduced 18 constitutional reforms the 6th of February, and he said that if they were to win the constitutional majority, he would introduce all these 18 reforms the 1st of September. In fact, he said, if I don't get them approved now, I will approve them the 1st of September if I win the constitutional majority. He didn't make much of an effort of approving them in February, but now he has that space, and he has already said that they will start with a profound reform of the judicial system.
Yeah, let me just give a parenthesis for our audience. The new Congress will take office in August, and the president doesn't leave office until October, correct?
That's a very good qualification, precision, because in most countries they enter at the same time, but in Mexico they have this lag. So President Lopez Obrador will be in charge of the presidency with this new Congress for 1 month, and he has said that he will introduce this. He said he would introduce the 1st of September. Yesterday, in his daily press, morning press, he said he would start with a profound revamp of the judicial system. But among these 18 reforms, it included a major revamp of the electoral system, basically destroying a very powerful electoral institute that was created to give certainty to the minority parties, including him when he was in the opposition, right, that the election would be correctly managed and that the political system would give space to minorities. Because in Mexico, for example, we have 500 representatives in the deputies, 300 of which are elected like in the states, in a district, but the 200 extra are based on the proportion of votes they got in the legislative election.
Right, so, that their parties got in the legislative, right?
Exactly, so he plans to destroy that. That is to create a majoritarian system, because in Mexico, big difference with the US where you have two parties, and therefore the Chamber of Deputies might change by, it's unlikely that one party will have 2/3 of the votes in the Chamber of Deputies. In Mexico, because of the nature of our political system, with such a strong Morena, if there were no proportional representation seats, with the 44% of the vote they got in this election, they would control almost 2/3 of the deputies. So they would be eliminating that. It includes some very troublesome, very worrisome things, such as in Mexico, we have this extremely authoritarian figure called prisión preventiva oficiosa, which means if you are accused of committing a crime which is labeled as serious crime,
without having to prove it.
Yeah, you just are accused with some minimal evidence. You're accused of killing someone, while your case is decided by the court, which can take years in the case of Mexico, you remain in prison. That means that around 40% of people that are in prisons and jails in Mexico are there waiting for a trial. The already very problematic thing is that these so-called serious crimes include stealing in a house. If you're accused of having stolen something in a house, even without violence, it is considered for political reasons crimen serio, a serious crime, and therefore you go to jail while waiting for your sentence.
That can be turned into a political weapon.
Without any counterpower. And among these reforms, it includes, and this is important for investors to have in mind, it would include prisión preventiva oficiosa for fiscal fraud. So if you're accused by the Mexican authority of having IRS, of having done whatever, because as you all know, there are a lot of technical details when you file your taxes, and therefore you might make a mistake, but if the government considers that mistake was really based on bad faith, they will accuse you of fiscal fraud. We don't know the details, but after a certain level of fiscal fraud, you will end in jail while the courts decide whether you are guilty or not. So that's extremely problematic. And there are several other issues that are in that 18 constitutional reform. Some of them are very generous pensions that would be very difficult to pay. The disappearance of all autonomous bodies. Let's say your antitrust commission would end being autonomous. In the case of the US, it's not constitutionally autonomous, but it works autonomously from the Department of Justice. The idea is sending all that back to in this case, to the Ministry of Economy, and therefore an antitrust issue would be decided by the minister, which of course gives a lot of discretionary power to whomever is the minister. So the basic thrust of these reforms is concentrating power and giving discretionary space to whoever has the power to decide in X or Y decision. But let me give more detail on what they mean about a profound reform of the federal judicial system. It means, and sounds very democratic, that we will completely erase the current courts, and whomever is currently a judge or a justice or a magistrate will lose their jobs. We will start afresh, and all of them, magistrates, ministers, judges, justices, will be elected by universal suffrage, which is of course very problematic because no one will be really interested in something like this. It's very expensive to put a ballot in every station, which are 170,000 stations in the last presidential election. But the more problematic thing is that it means that whomever has the majority will be selecting everyone in the judicial system, ensuring that loyal candidates will be appointed. To make things even more problematic, the whole control over the federal justice system, which is currently under the control of the Judicatura, which is a complex system but I won't describe, will be under the control of an administrative body responsive to the president. And therefore, they could discipline judges or magistrates or even justices that don't do their job correctly. So it will be probably the most...
You will be eliminating basically the
Exactly.
third branch.
You've said it better than I. It will be basically in any conflict between a private individual and the state, you will be granted no real fair trial because the whole system will be controlled by the government.
Carlos, let me dig a little bit deeper on this because this is really important. I mean, this is super delicate. If there was anyone in Mexico that was able to balance or even block some of the laws that AMLO wanted to pass during his own administration because they were considered unconstitutional, was actually the Supreme Court. So by destroying the judicial system and submitting judges to an election process, we would actually just be politicizing a whole branch that has been sort of independent. Do you know of any other country that has such a system, or is this just a Mexican invention?
In any Western democracy, I haven't seen that. In any of the democracies of Latin America, it has never happened. And let me give you even a more dramatic example. As you know well, Mexico had a revolution in 1917. What is interesting is that the judicial system of the Porfiriato continued. They didn't say, let's start anew afresh, because that's so complicated that they decided, well, this is a reform of the 1857 Constitution, that how it was originally called the 1978 Constitution, and the jurisprudence and the personnel of the old federal system remain. Of course, they changed the justices, they created new rules of how to manage them, but they didn't destroy to zero Because if you fail in doing this well, you not only you will end giving all the power to the executive, but for a long time you won't have anything because the transition is extremely complicated. How do you manage it?
It doesn't sound very practical.
Well, but these guys are not practical, as you are well aware. We had this, well, imperfect, but it worked, Seguro Popular, which was this medical, public medical health system for those that have no formal job. And it has some limitations, but it gave some health protection to millions, tens of millions.
Yeah, correct.
And they destroyed that and created a new system without knowing how that new system would work. And in fact, that new system has already been canceled as well because it never worked.
Yeah, it's better to leave the country with nothing.
That's more than what happened. Of course, it's easier if you're a poor guy without access to public sector health. It's expensive, but you have a private sector there where you can buy your medicines or pay for a doctor. In terms of the federal justice system, of course, it's very, very difficult to imagine the transition. They could devise something that works well. Let's say it's going to take 5 years, and we will be replacing slowly whatever, but it's complicated. And once you arrive to the terminal station, you will have this system completely controlled by the executive. And as you said, this doesn't exist in any other Latin American country, in any European country. You probably will have to go to countries like the Soviet Union or Cuba to find such a concentration of power.
And I can only imagine the impact that something like this will have for investment. I mean, that's literally even eliminating the idea that there is rule of law.
Exactly. That is the main problem that today, as you probably have been following Mexican financial markets, after this massive victory of Morena, which few people were expecting, yesterday the markets were very, very, very choppy waters, today as well. And we had this very brief press conference of the Ministry of Hacienda, Rogelio Ramírez de la O. And it was a very, very, very brief conference, which I haven't heard, but I've just read. And he said something like, don't be worried, the central bank will be autonomous, blah, 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 and we will defend the rule of law. The problem with the phrase rule of law is that, of course, the rule of law might be that you decide everything. That's the rule of law. But that's not a rule of law that gives any certainty to whomever it's not you. And therefore, that's the kind of issues they will have to decide. Claudia Sheinbaum has to decide, and it's going to be, she's the one that has the power and therefore the responsibility. She has to decide whether that's the game she wants to play. She has the cards to do that.
Will she be a puppet of Lopez Obrador, or will she grow into her own woman?
I don't think. I think she has the personality and the mandate. The mandate was given to her, and it was much larger than what I think even them expected. And if you look at the more specific details, people voted in some states specifically for her. Let me give you the example of Guanajuato. Guanajuato, which was the only state that the PAN won of the 9 federal entities that were in dispute. Guanajuato, the state of Guanajuato, was won by the PAN with a large margin, around 15 points. But Claudia won in the state of Guanajuato against Xochitl by a relatively large margin. So it was her victory. She performed better than Morena.
Yeah.
And therefore, she has to, and I'm sure she understands that the power is now hers. There's a long transition, as you explained, from now to the 1st of October. But whatever is decided in September, if they were to introduce these reforms, is going to mark her sexennial.
And her legacy.
So she better understand well what are the implications, and she better know well what she wants.
Let me ask you something. Morena is not a traditional institutional party like the PRI was, right? In fact, it's a movement composed by many factions from the very extreme right to the very extreme left and everything in the middle. AMLO is the only one that so far has been able to manage Morena. What do you think will be the role of AMLO in now, or let's say in October, once Claudia takes office? Will she be able to control Morena because now she has the power, or will she still need him for that?
I thought months ago that for her it would be difficult to gain control over Morena, but with this victory, I think that she has all the space. Her margin in both chambers is very, very large. Governors know well how powerful she is. AMLO has already centralized a lot of institutions, so their margin of maneuver is more limited. She's going to be in that chair for 6 years, so she will have the space. I think that she has to manage it well, has to decide how to confront Lopez Obrador. That's a very strong character. But Lopez Obrador won't be sitting in the presidential chair. He will be in his ranch, in his hacienda in Palenque, Chiapas, very near to his home state of Tabasco. And even though some of the ministers of AMLO will apparently continue, one we know will is the current Minister of Hacienda, has been already reappointed by Claudia Sheinbaum as the next Secretary of Hacienda, or will continue being the Secretary of Hacienda with her. But power is power.
I think it was Machiavelli who said that power couldn't be shared. Do you agree with that?
She'll have to be careful because AMLO hates someone else taking decisions. But I don't know if she'll be able to do it, but I think she has all the instruments to do it.
We have spoken about Ramirez de la Hoz staying as Secretary of Hacienda, at least for now. What message do you think she was trying to send by keeping him on the job and not choosing a person from her own team? Actually, does she have any good people to pick from?
I think the first question is relatively straightforward to answer, which is continuity. As you probably know well, AMLO received very stable public finances, a deficit of 2 points of GDP, a very low ratio of debt vis-a-vis GDP. He was quite prudent for the first 5 years, but in this last year he's been
anything but.
Exactly. So he will be inheriting a deficit of around 6 points of GDP.
That's a big deficit.
It's a big deficit and 3 times larger than the one he received. We had a lot of trusts, that fideicomisos, which were devised to help the public finances in case, for example,
of a hurricane
or a lower price of oil. And those fideicomisos, those trusts, are basically dry, so they don't have that margin of maneuver. And so I think that the basic message is there will be continuity. The guy that knows the current state of public finance will be there to help me, as he said in his conference, slightly vague, no real details, but we will return to a low deficit as a percentage of GDP next year to give some certainty to the markets.
Right, but how do you do that? Either you raise taxes or you increase growth. And in order to increase growth, you need investment. And without rule of law, it's like they're putting themselves in a tough...
That's exactly the dilemma. There's very strong winds in favor of the Mexican economy. Even with all this electoral uncertainty, a very poorly managed electricity sector that has led to some blackouts in this very hot May we just ended, even with a very anti-business rhetoric, private investment has been growing a lot. Why? Because the opportunities are there. Therefore, maybe they think that animal spirits will be so strong that they'll be prepared to swallow that uncertainty. Maybe that's what they're thinking. And some investors will be prepared to do that. I mean, people invest in El Congo. It's not that you only invest in Switzerland. The problem, of course, is that the guys that invest in El Congo have a different
risk appetite and reward appetite, right?
Exactly, a different expected return. Probably rougher guys, less institutionalized, more keen to help them in the relationship with the government by giving envelopes, and therefore you attract a different kind of investment. It will never be as deep pocket and professional as the more conservative one, but you can find it. That may be a decision for them, but at the end, it certainly will create a less positive economic environment and therefore less capacity to grow. And without growth, it's more difficult to confront the challenges of public finances. Because you said, how are you going to diminish the deficit? The best way of diminishing the deficit is growing more. If we were to grow 7% instead of the 1% we've grown on average this sexennial, but
yeah, the government will have more resources for sure. Yeah,
the economy, which is losing acceleration, is losing speed. If that trend continue or we enter into a recession, the margin of maneuver is smaller. But they may be prepared to pay that margin in order to concentrate the power. I don't know. That's her decision. I'm sure there are several voices within her team, some more in favor of a prudent reform in the judicial system, and some others saying today is the moment of destroying that system that has protected the interest of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists, of the business, however you want to call them. Which, if you look at the discourse of the last minister appointed by AMLO, Lenia Batres, is more or less what she says.
Speaking about investors, there are many interested in the Mexican energy industry, and they're worried now about Morena having such a strong mandate that they could even reverse the energy reforms passed during the Peña Nieto administration, which basically opened both the oil, gas, and electricity markets to other investors and to competition. How do you envision this evolving, Carlos? Will they be reversed?
Well, among those 18 constitutional reform was return or even having an even stricter constitutional regime for the energy sector than the one we had prior to Peña Nieto's reform of the year 2014. So if she were to introduce and approve this reform, the space would be severely limited. One of the things investors thought was, well, at least the constitution was not changed, and therefore
we still have a legal basis, right?
Not only a legal basis, but whomever wins will have the space to return to the constitution that is
static quo ante.
Exactly. But now Claudia doesn't have that excuse. Her normal excuse will be, I cannot do the constitutional reform. Now you can. So in order not to do it, you have to make your case to Morena and explain why and what's going to be your model. In fact, it's quite problematic for her in a way because her whole discourse with investors was that, yeah, there will be restrictions, but we have all this legal framework and that will create the space for private investors. So she had to take a decision there as well.
She will certainly have a pretty difficult job in managing not only a country with a series of challenges, but also in keeping Morena on board. Carlos, let me just switch gears for a second and ask you about USMCA, because USMCA includes the energy reforms that were passed prior to its signing, but also many other mechanisms such as the energy regulator, for example. If Mexico were to change this entire framework, how would that impact USMCA?
You're right, Mariana. The first problem for Claudia Sheinbaum, if he were to change the constitution, and not only with respect to energy, but some of these autonomous bodies are part of the institutional framework that regulates the economy and that is in some way included in USMEC. So in order to do that changes, you would have to either renegotiate the treaty, which is highly risky, highly unlikely. And if you open the treaty, you probably end with more restrictions than what we have right now, because you will be facing either
Correct. You can be opening a Pandora box.
A Pandora box is exactly the word. Or try to navigate with a more or less irregular link with the states, but they won't tolerate it. Biden has been very prudent with AMLO because the border is hot. Is a reason why he might be elected or not, re-elected or not, is one of the reasons. So AMLO has the control over to permit more or less flow to the Mexican-US border from non-Mexican migrants. And therefore, some of the panels that
he's been using it as a bargaining chip, don't you think?
The panels that should have been triggered because our violations of the treaty have not been triggered by the US, by a new administration, whether Biden or Trump. None of the two can be reelected. The two of them would start afresh a new administration, and there are a lot of grievances of US interest against these restrictions for not only the energy sector, but the importation of corn, genetically modified corn, and other issues that I think would also create a dilemma for Claudia. She wants this revamp of the Constitution and therefore risk losing NAFTA, or she will accept these restrictions and start to work with them in order to, and this has to be underscored, Mariana, in order to have enough energy to make nearshoring real force of growth for the Mexican economy. Because CFE, our state-owned electricity firm, has no capacity to provide all the clean energy that nearshoring needs. So it's even a little bit. It's completely ridiculous if you try to explain this to a foreign investor, that there are some solar plants or wind plants that are ready but haven't been connected to the grid for stupid technical reasons or just because they don't want, and we're burning coal or coal-based fuels that are more expensive for CFE than paying for the clean energy of a solar plant for logical reasons.
I know. I mean, honestly, how can you explain that? Carlos, how do you square the circle? On the one hand, Claudia has spoken about nearshoring, and she understands that it represents a big opportunity for Mexico. But on the other hand, she also wants to give Pemex and the CFE, the utility company, a much bigger role in the economy. Aren't they just mutually exclusive goals?
Yeah, that's her dilemma, among many others. Because the electricity sector, for example, is very different from the oil. Because in electricity, even if you were today to return to more rational rules, more based on connecting the marginally less costly plant, allowing competition among different actors to provide the cheapest electricity possible to CFE or to private consumers, even if CFE, who has the monopoly of transmission and distribution, start investing again in the only area where they do have that monopoly and where they do earn a lot of money, but they haven't invested enough. So parts of the problem are currently the congestion of these lines. Even if everything would start to be, would return to a rational policy, we will still be risking 4 or 5 years of problematic access to clean electricity. So if they don't do it now and start roaming around or follow the incorrect policies, not only will it create a problem with NAFTA, with USMEC, but it will also create a very serious problem with the capacity to provide enough energy for the economy. One of the reasons the electricity blackouts arrived till May is that the economy hadn't grown much, and therefore the supply of electricity created during the Peña Nieto administration wasn't being fully used. Of course, one possibility to gain space is the economy doesn't grow much because of all this legal uncertainty we've been talking about. But that would be sacrificing growth. In oil, the problem is different because if you don't have enough Mexican gasoline, which in fact we don't have, we import a lot, there's this easy market in the world to bring gasoline from Rotterdam or from wherever you want. The infrastructure is there, but you cannot import electricity from Spain to Mexico City. That's something you cannot do, and therefore, in oil the problem is different. Is that a supply of energy can be imported if we don't produce enough or we don't produce enough oil, but that's not the real problem. The real problem is the fiscal cost of Pemex. Fact that Pemex used to provide around, in the year 2012, around 6 points of GDP of resources to the federal government. This year it is expected to be less than 1% of GDP. It's still not costing us. It's very low rent. But if you look at the first term of this year, it is costing us. The amount of money that Pemex gave to the federal government is less than the money Pemex received from the federal government. So we are already there. Pemex promised that we would be producing this year around 2.7 million barrels per day. We are producing 1.7 and going down. Pemex Industrial Transformation, which basically produces gasoline and diesel, it has lost the staggering figure of 800 billion pesos in the first 5 years of this administration. So it's really a black hole that we have to address. And it seems that they believe that it's just a question of pumping more money to Pemex, and at some moment it will become efficient and productive. Unhappily, I think they're wrong.
What about gas, Carlos?
That's a very interesting story because natural gas is the main fuel for our electric plants, and is of course basic for industry.
Right, and it mostly comes from Texas, right?
Pemex production has been declining for the last 20 years, and that decline hasn't stopped in this administration. Although they've invested quite a lot of money, they haven't been successful in developing new fields, and therefore, as you said, we import more natural gas from the United States than what Germany imported from Russia.
Oh wow, that's an interesting comparison.
The proportion of our consumption, and therefore we are extremely dependent on those pipes that come from Texas. Of course, we are all both dependent on. They are dependent that we consume that gas, because if we weren't consuming it, they would have to burn it, and it's illegal to burn that gas, and that gas is associated with the oil production of many of the Texan non-conventional oil reserves. So it will be complex for the U.S. just to shut the pipes, but the risk is there, and it's amazing that they don't seem to care. We still have a lot of resources that haven't been exploited or even well discovered in gas and in oil. That was the aim of the 2014 constitutional and legal reform, to create a different framework that will allow the government, that is the owner of all these reserves, to make an offer that would allow anyone, the one that pays more, to have the concession, invest money, and extract oil or gas. This administration stopped doing that, and Pemex is just incapable of doing by itself. So not only we're losing money, but we probably won't extract all the resources that we have in under our soil.
Let me close this episode just by asking you, I'm sure you have a best and a worst case scenario for what is to come. Which one would you say is the most likely one in your view?
Well, I really don't know which is the most likely one. Perhaps I would just very quickly draw the two scenarios and let's see how things developed. Because I think it's still an open book. I think it's more likely that they would rather concentrate power than understand the needs of the market, but I might be proved wrong. I would be happily proved wrong. So let me go to the more pessimistic scenario. The most pessimistic scenario is that they decided to introduce some or all of these 18 constitutional reforms, and therefore the checks and balances of a democracy would be erased. This will provide a lot of certainty for private investors. That would mean less growth, probably migration of rich Mexican people, or even of some firms that would like to work in this environment. This would create a lot of tension with our partners in North America, the US and Canada, would open a thorny issue in the revision of the treaty next year, will create more unemployment, less fiscal income, a more complex economic environment for the new government. It seems so irrational to go that way. That's why I don't think it's necessarily the road that Claudia will take. Because on the other hand, the other scenario can be quite rosy. There are some real obstacles in the future, like who wins the US presidency, how they win, what kind of policy they want to follow. We still have this external uncertainty. But assuming that either Trump or Biden wins, they make some amendments or revisions or ask certain additional things to the Mexican government that can be accommodated. And we have this space that nearshoring is providing as a result of a geopolitical, geostrategical decision of the US of being less dependent in Chinese Chinese products. And therefore, if you revamp the judicial system, but by doing that, you create more certainty, not less. If you open the electricity and oil sector again, providing more energy and more fiscal resources, that Claudia could really be presiding an economic boom that make her legacy, I think, more attractive. But of course, they might see the world differently and don't understand or believe that things can be accommodated with that concentration of power. So we'll know very soon because, as we said, the new legislative power, the two chambers will start the 1st of September, and the new president will be inaugurated the 1st of October.
Yep. So, unfortunately, Carlos, we have come to the end of this episode, and I will just close by hoping that our first female president will be much more pragmatic than ideologic, and that will certainly open a lot of opportunities for Mexico.
That sounds great. I hope you're right. I fully support your optimist conclusion. I hope they understand it, that that's her opportunity. She understands that it's a historical opportunity, and she's careful enough to do the correct things.
Carlos, as always, a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I always learn so much, and thank you so much for doing this with us.
Muchas gracias, Mariana. It was a great pleasure. Hope to see you soon.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog